This is a bit of a follow-up to the presentation I did about a year ago, I guess, a year ago, November, which was an introduction to the line engraved stamps of Great Britain. Um, and at the time, I had intended to talk a bit about plating the stamps, but very quickly realized that it was already a big subject and that plating is a whole other rabbit hole down which to dive. So I thought, why not break it out into a second presentation. Um, so I'll be covering a little bit of the material that we covered a year ago, just because it's important to understand how the stamps were printed when talking about plating them. Um, in a nutshell, the British Post Office prepared 431 printing plates, which were used to print just the 1 penny line engraved stamps between 1840 and 1879. Um, Plating is what we call the activity or hobby of determining which plate was used to print a specific stamp. And I call it the conceit. The conceit of this plating is that each of the 103,000 individual stamps printed on these 431 plates can be uniquely identified. That's, in theory, that's true. In practice, it's challenging, and there's still some positions on some plates that are debated and so on. But for the most part, yeah, it's possible to identify and potentially collect 103,000 stamps, which to most human beings appear absolutely identical. So tonight I'm gonna talk about the printing process that was used for the line engraved stamps, and how that printing process resulted in features of the stamps that allow them to be plated. I'm going to talk about 4 or 5 categories of penny and also the tuppenny stamps and the resources that are required or available to plate stamps in each of those categories, because they are different. And talk about the available resources, and then do a quick run through of the plating process for each of these categories. Um, and just off the top, I want to say from personal experience, plating is a resource intensive activity. You need a lot of reference materials. There's been books published on the subject for well over 100 years now. There's now digital images available of the imprimatur sheets held by the Postal Museum in London, and we'll talk about that. There's now also online resources, tools, and discussion forums that are very valuable in pursuing this. And it requires a lot of time and practice and experience. It's very much a skill which needs to be worked on and practiced. So line engraved printing. This was the process that was chosen, the security printing process that was chosen to print the first postage stamps. It was a method developed by Jacob Perkins, who was an American, actually, and who came to the UK in the 1820s, I believe, to try and get contracts to print banknotes, and was unsuccessful. But when Rowland Hill was looking for a way of securely printing postage stamps, postage labels, they chose Perkins Bacon at the time. Bacon was a British partner. So the plate production or the stamp production process had a series of steps. First, a master die was engraved in soft steel, and this singular master die, which exists still in the Postal Museum, was the basis for 70 or 80 billion stamps that were printed over a 40-year time period. From the master die, which was, after being engraved, it was hardened. They then used transfer rollers made of soft steel. They would roll them or rock them over the master die to transfer the image to the transfer roller. They would then harden the transfer rollers and in turn rock those over the printing plates to impress the image into the printing plates. 240 images would be impressed on each plate. They'd then have to do some cleanup, filing down burrs and other obvious defects after the rocking process. And finally, they would punch corner letters, distinct corner letter combinations into each stamp on the plate. And we've talked about that before. There are 20 rows of 12 stamps, and we'll talk about the lettering. And the significance of this process for plating is that each step created distinguishing characteristics that can be seen on the finished stamp. So each stamp is, in fact, a unique creation, even though they come from the same master die. By the time the image is on the plate and the plate is used for printing, it is possible in just about every case with the right information to determine that a stamp came from a particular plate. This is on the right. You can see an image of taken from the master die. Actually, sorry, that is an image of the master die, not an image, and you can tell because it's backwards. If we run through the process, engraving a master die, creating transfer rollers, and then printing plates. The printing plates are negative images because when they are printed on the paper, you get a positive image. And so working backwards, it means the transfer roller is a positive image and the master die is a negative image. So when you see the image of the master die here, you can see that the queen is facing to the right, the opposite way that she is on the stamps, and the words on the die are backwards. And the other thing of note is that the lower corners where the letters appear on the stamps, they're blank on the die. And in fact, they're blank on the transfer roller images. And I've shown below an example of a rainbow trial. These were stamps that were printed in the summer of 1840 when there was concern about the colors of the dies and the postmarks being used and whether postmarks could be removed so that the stamps could be reused. So they printed a bunch of test images from the transfer rollers, and because they were internal test images, they didn't bother punching the letters in the lower corners. So you can see this is an actual stamp, and it's printed in blue, even though it's a penny stamp. They tested a bunch of different ink colors, but my point here is that you can see that there's no corner letter and no corner letters in the lower corners. This is an image of a transfer roller, not from that period. There are no real images. Obviously, there was no photography, but there's no imagery of the actual plates or transfer rollers. The only surviving artifact we have is the original master die. But this is the same, this is a more modern transfer roller used for exactly the same process. So you can see there's several images around the circumference of the roller. They're positive images. You can see that the word postage stands out. And the images, as I say, were created by rocking this steel roller over the master die, a hardened master die with a soft steel transfer roller so that the image could be transferred. And then they would harden the transfer roller and use it to impress the images into a soft steel plate. The machine on the left is, again, a slightly more modern version of the machines that were used to apply the images from the transfer rollers onto the plate. So there's a steel plate on the bed of that machine, and the transfer roller is attached to the arm above it, and they move the plate around and then apply a lot of pressure to the transfer roller and rock it back and forth to put each image onto the plate. And in the lower right, you can see, again, a more modern version of this. I think this is an American system at work. So the same process, I don't know if it's in use today, but it certainly was in use well into the 20th century. It's a really good process for creating plates. There were problems with the technology back in the 1840s and 50s, mainly due to the fact that it was the 1840s and 1850s, and there was no electricity, there was no electric lighting. Everything was done manually or with steam power. And so, in retrospect, the quality of the plates and the stamps was remarkable, but there definitely were imperfections, which are what are useful to modern collectors and platers of the stamps. This is a proof sheet in the Postal Museum of the first penny black plate 1A. And these sheets are called imprimaturs, and we'll be talking a lot about the imprimatur sheets. You can see that it's laid out in 20 rows, 12 stamps per row, and this followed the logic of this was to match the British currency at the time, which had 12 pennies to a shilling. So a row of stamps on the sheet could be cut off and sold for a shilling, and there were 20 shillings in a pound. So 240 pennies in a pound, 240 stamps on a sheet. So a sheet of penny stamps would have cost £1 at the time. The fourth step in the process is cleaning up the plate. So after the transfer roller was used to impress images, there would generally, because of the varying pressure of the transfer rollers, you'd sometimes get ridges that would build up around the edges of the stamp image, and so they would be ground down and cleaned up, and this would sometimes leave minor imperfections on the plate. And then the final step was punching the corner letters, which I like to think was a job given to apprentices because it would have been so darn tedious. 240 stamps on a steel plate or images on a steel plate, and each image had a unique combination of letters. So the stamp on the upper left had the letters AA, the stamp on the lower right had the letters TL. So this is a box of punches from the era that was found in a filing room or drawer at the Royal Philatelic Society not that long ago. I think this century somebody came across it, and so these are tiny punches. So the letters they're punching into the stamps are less than a millimeter high. I think they're 0.6 or 0.7 of a millimeter high. So you can imagine somebody trying and finding the right punch, putting it in the punch holder, which you can see at the bottom, and then aligning it over these tiny squares and trying to center it and have it aligned upright, and then punching it into the soft steel, which is no easy feat. Putting an indentation in steel requires a fair bit of force. And this would have been done 480 times, 240 stamps, 2 letters per stamp, and they would have had to get it exactly right. There are examples of stamps where somebody made a mistake, and you can see where they ground off the letter that was mistakenly punched in and then replaced it with the correct letter. But for the most part, this was done very accurately. And so here we have a block of penny reds, and you can see that these are from row F and row G. And so the upper left stamp is row F, column A, and then to the right, row F, column B. So this was how they laid out the lettering, so that each stamp on the plate, each image on the plate, and each stamp on the sheet had a unique lettering. And the rationale for this was security, was to make sure there was a real mix of letter combinations on the printed stamps. And if anybody tried to counterfeit the stamps, presumably somebody would notice that there were a lot of stamps, with the letters AA, because whoever was counterfeiting it used those letters. So I think that was the rationale, but it was completely a result of concerns over counterfeiting and security. And in fact, that rationale came out of the printed currency process and that operation right from the late 1700s. Counterfeiting of banknotes was a huge problem in the UK and in America. And in fact, when Jacob Perkins developed this printing process, the motivation was to produce secure banknotes, was to come up with a process for reliably repeating images, because before that there were always variations between the printed banknotes on a plate, and this process allowed them to get them remarkably similar. And so we come to the first feature of the stamps, which you'll see later helps us with plating, and that is, because the letters are punched by hand on each stamp, they're never perfect. Well, they are sometimes, but they're rarely perfect. More often than not, they're shifted to the side or up or down, and in some cases they're tilted. Sometimes there's a double blow, and the letter shows up as being doubled, or there's a defect on the punch that appears for a certain number of the images on the plate, and then goes away, so you can identify positions from the appearance of these defects. Over time, the font that was used on the punches was changed. So they started off with alphabet 1 in 1840 on the penny blacks and the early reds, and then they brought in new punch sets a number of years later with alphabet 2, which had broader and heavier letters. Alphabet 3 came in the mid 1850s with taller and skinnier letters. Alphabet 4 was used on only 2 plates, and there's still some discussion as to whether these came from punchers or whether the letters were hand engraved on the plates. It's generally felt that they were engraved, but there's apparently some evidence that there may have been an alphabet 4 punch set. And then alphabet 5 is what I call the sans serif letters on what we call the 4 corner penny reds. So all of the penny reds, the first 4 categories here, all have stars in the upper corners. The final grouping, which came into use in around 1865, are the 4 corner letter penny reds, and they have clearly distinguishable corner letters because they're sans serif. And these are also the stamps that have the plate numbers engraved in the scroll work at the side of the stamp. So what we end up with is, you can see that I've listed the process elements here: the master die, the transfer roller, creation of the plate from the transfer roller, cleanup and check letters. And then there's all sorts of identifying characteristics that come out of those elements. So for example, with the master die, they did a cleanup of it in the mid 1850s. They re-engraved it, and so anything before that is considered die 1. Anything after that is die 2. So a die 1 stamp, all of the stamps before that time are die 1, and all of the stamps printed after that are die 2. So it's a useful way of distinguishing which era the stamp was printed in, but it's not helpful in plating, because all of the plates before that time had die 1 images on them. Transfer roller defects, you might get a problem in the creation of the transfer roller, and then you'd see that problem, that defect, show up in all of the stamps on a particular plate, or half the stamps on a particular plate, depending on how long the transfer roller was used. So we begin to narrow down by identifying these defects. And things like, if anybody's looked at penny blacks and looked at plating penny blacks, there was a ray flaw on plate 1 in the star in the upper left corner, which we'll talk about later. That came out of a transfer roller defect, because the same flaw appears on most of the stamps on plate 1. So it wasn't a defect in the master die. It wasn't a defect that happened when they were creating the plate. It was a defect on the image on the transfer roller itself that then was repeated throughout the plate. The plate creation process guidelines were laid down. Sometimes the bed of the machine wasn't aligned properly, and so stamps were laid out with a tilt angle. With the cleanup I mentioned, cleaning up the images on the plate, you'd get what they call burr rubs or transfer roller lines, which are the result of the grinding and cleanup process on the plate. And then, as I said, the check letters are what make a stamp absolutely unique because they were punched into each image individually and separately. So the alphabet of the check letter is a clue, and then the letter position and orientation and any flaws in the letters are useful. And then the bottom two rows, I had to include this. There were repairs done on many of the plates over the years, particularly the penny black plates when the technology was new. And plate one was so badly worn within a few weeks of use, they actually essentially repaired the whole plate. They relayed down all of the images and created plate 1B. That's why we distinguish between 1A and 1B. But on the other plates, that didn't happen. There were repairs done to particular images, but not entire plates from that point on. Die 1 and die 2. It's used if you're identifying penny reds. It's useful to have some understanding of the differences. The Scott Catalogue talks about they refer to it as the re-engraved die. Gibbons refers to die 1 and 2, and most British collectors and resources refer to die 1 and 2, but Scott refers to the second die as the re-engraved die. And you fairly quickly learn to distinguish the two. There's some darker lines that appear in the hair above the crown, which is useful. The engraving around her eye is much darker in die 2 stamps. Die 1 was really wearing out towards the end of its life, so the difference between a die 1 and a die 2 stamp is quite quite obvious. The complication is when you get a heavy postmark over it and you can't make out these key features. That's what makes it challenging sometimes, distinguishing between the two dies. So what I've done is broken 40 years of penny stamps, and we'll talk about the tuppenny stamps briefly towards the end, but 40 years of penny stamps into 4 categories for plating. There's the penny blacks, which always belong in their own group, and they were the ones that people started plating early on in the late 1800s, early 1900s. There were already books being published that talked about the attributes of particular stamps on each plate and how to plate them. So those penny blacks are actually the most straightforward to plate. Plus, there were only essentially 12 plates, 11 plates, but plate 1 existed as 1A and 1B. So there's essentially 12 plates, as opposed to the 175 plates that were used to print the penny red stamps in die 1. And that's the second category. The red, brown, imperforate, and the early perforated stamps were prepared from the same die 1 sheets. So it's a different, it's a more complicated process to deal with those stamps. After the transition to die 2, there were about 70 plates issued as die 2 without the 4 corner letters and without the plate numbers engraved in the sides. These are actually the more challenging ones to plate, and it's only recently, and by recently I mean since the 1960s and 70s, that people have been reliably plating these stamps. And then the final group are the 4 corner letter stamps, which in theory are dead easy to plate, but I'll show you a way of confirming the plating of a stamp because sometimes the engraved plate number in the scroll work is not as clear as it should be, or it might be obscured by a postmark. So I'll show you a trick for confirming the plating of those stamps. So the whole basis of plating 430 plates is the existence of these imprimatur plate images. Um, about half of the penny black plates, we still have all or most of the imprimatur sheets surviving. All of the penny red plates, so everything from plate 12 through to through to the end of the line engraved era in 1879, we have all of the imprimatur sheets in the Postal Museum in London, which means that it's possible to get images of each of the stamps on the plate as a reference. And I'm not aware of any other postal authority where this has happened. I don't know a lot about American philately, but my understanding is the basis for plating the early stamps is much more difficult. There's a lot more detective work involved in trying to recreate the plates and understand how the plates work. With the British stamps, it's, as I say, in theory, it's dead easy because the imprimaturs exist. The exception are, and you'll see on this, this is plate 1, you'll see that stamp AL is missing, and you'll see that the bottom row, which it's either row S or T, I think it's row T, is missing. And this was because from the official registration or imprimatur sheet, they would cut out individual stamps, and Rowland Hill would get a stamp, and the Queen or her grandson, who became George V, would be sent a stamp. And so various officials would be sent stamps every time a new plate was registered. And annoyingly, this makes it more difficult to plate some stamps from these plates. Most of the stamps are intact, but often the T row, sometimes the entire A row, and we'll see later, sometimes the H and I rows in the middle got hacked into for purposes of creating essentially souvenirs, although I guess some were saved for official purposes. These imprimaturs do exist to this day. There's people who collect them. They're not cheap. They're not outrageously expensive, but yeah, they are, they're listed in the catalogs. So for penny black plating, I'll quickly run through the resources. There's two books that I've used. The Litchfield book, the blue one, is, I think, the best one. It's smaller and lighter and more convenient to carry around. The Nissen book on the right is the classic work, and it has essentially the same information as the Litchfield book, but it includes images, almost 3,000 images of each of the penny blacks, each stamp by plate. It's a very expensive book. Original editions are almost impossible to find. This one is a reprint from, I think, the 1980s or 1990s that Stanley Gibbons did, and even those are rare and hard to come by. And I'm going to walk you through the process of plating a penny black using this information. This is a sample from the Litchfield book. So this is for stamp AK. So if you have a penny black with the letters AK, this is the information he gives you for trying to identify whether it's plate 1A, 1B, right through to plate 11. And the groupings, the group A, so plates 1A, B, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 11, mean that there's distinguishing characteristics. So it's quite straightforward to identify whether a stamp AK is from one of those plates. The group B ones mean that it's not as clear. Sometimes it's it's never impossible, but sometimes it's a lot more challenging. So he's broken group B are plates 2 and 10. He's saying, they're more difficult to distinguish. They've got fewer distinguishing characteristics. And then the section C relates to second or third states where stamps have been repaired, and we're not going to talk about that tonight. The other resource, which is books like the Litchfield and Nissen books are good resources. The other critical resource are digital or photographic images of the imprimatur sheets. There was a time in the last century, when the only way to get at these images was to buy fairly expensive photographic reproductions of these plates. As you can imagine, these are full-size sheets. They're quite large sheets of stamps. And so the photographic reproductions were very large prints. And you could obtain photographic prints, but to get them for 175 or more individual plates was quite onerous, and not a lot of people had access to those. Excuse me. What's happened now is thanks to the computer age, we have digital copies of these images. So the Postal Museum themselves maintain digital images. That the image on the right I downloaded from the Postal Museum website in London, and they have available online all of the images for all of the imprimatur sheets that they hold, which, as I say, is all of the penny red plates, all of the tuppenny blue plates, everything except for a few of the penny black plates, which for whatever reason were not preserved. These images are useful. They're not as high a quality as the photographic images that were previously used, but these are, I mean, these are, the price is right, they're free, and they're still pretty darn good. And then the third resource is there are collectors, mainly in the UK, who over the years have taken the higher quality images and digitized them and rearranged them and made them available on CDs. And I'll be talking about this. I find these to be the most useful. There is a cost involved, but they're absolutely invaluable. You can, plate, certainly using the penny black images, you can very quickly plate a penny black or a tuppenny blue. And the penny reds, they're very helpful. The main reason being, well, I'll show you later on, but they've rearranged them so that you have an image with all of the AA images from a sheet. You're not looking at an image of a sheet. You're looking at all the AAs from a variety of plates. And so you can make the comparison with the stamp you're trying to match. Another resource that was developed starting in the 1960s, and you could argue that these guys were crazy, very keen philatelists specializing in these stamps. Roland Brown, and then with the assistance of Harold Fisher, they developed a system, or Roland Brown developed a system for measuring the positions of the corner letters in the squares and obtaining 4 measurements, 2 for each letter, which in theory would uniquely identify or at least narrow down the plate from which a stamp comes. He developed a tool, which I'll show you, a little plastic gauge, which allows you to take a stamp and take these 4 key measurements of the letter positions within a 30th of a millimeter, which is the precision you need. And it's completely manual. It's the wonderful thing about it is it's a method that comes out of mechanical engineering in the days before computers and electronic measuring instruments, that allows you to measure very accurately. And it works, and it's been working since the 1960s. So these 2 guys went through all of the imprimatur sheets in the Postal Museum and measured for 50,000 stamps on 400 about 200 die 1 plates. They just did it for die 1. they passed away before they could get to die 2. And for each stamp, they took 4 measurements of the check letters off of the imprimatur sheets. They then published these in 5 successive volumes. This is volume 1, which covers plates 1A through 45. And includes all of the stamps. And then they made best efforts to track down the missing imprimatur images so that they could fill in the gaps that we saw in the imprimatur sheets. So there's very few stamps that are missing from these measurement records. In the middle, you see an image of the plating gauge devised by Roland Brown. And on the right, this is a sample page lookup table from the book. It looks complicated. Here we have the data for stamp MI on the left and stamp MJ on the right. So you work through the book, a letter combination at a time from AA through to TL. And then down the middle column, you see the plate numbers. So for plate 1B, you've got for stamp MI, four measurements, which are the key measurements of the corner letter positions, and then a list of other characteristics. So not only were they measuring the stamps, they were looking for other distinguishing characteristics, guidelines, tilted letters, various marks, indications that reentries were done or repairs, and there's dozens of various characteristics that they also annotated in these books. So they're wonderful books. Um, so now I'll launch into plating die one stamps. We'll start with the penny blacks. So this is an image of a stamp on a cover, and the letters are HD. And as I say here ambitiously, plating can be done relatively easy just using the books without even resorting to the imprimatur images. So this is the excerpt from the Litchfield book for stamps with the corner letters HD. And we can see down the left side plates 1A, 1B, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then in category B, he's listed stamps 6, 8, and 9. So when you work with penny blacks, there's two major flaws that eventually start to jump out at you. And one of them is, and if you can see in the upper left ray on the stamp or star, the rays are numbered by clock position. So there's 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The 10 o'clock ray flaw appears on almost every stamp on plate 1 and a lot of the stamps on plate 2. So the fact that this stamp is missing that 10 o'clock ray, ignore the other line just to the left of it for now. That's something else that we'll talk about. But the fact that the 10 o'clock ray is missing is an indication that it's probably from plate 1. And in fact, if we look at the description over on the left, we see for plate 1A, RF, ray flaw 10 and 5. So there's also a problem with the 5 o'clock ray. It's a little short. And then re-entry, upper and D squares. So if you look at this upper right square, you can see some funny lines in there and a couple of marks. And then there's this other mark in the upper left square over here. Those indicate that the image was re-entered, which means that when they were laying out this image on the plate with the transfer roller, for some reason, somebody looked at it and said, this isn't quite right. And so they tried to line up the transfer roller and do a second impression or to reinforce the impression of the image on the plate. And this was done a fair bit. In this case, the defects that resulted are quite clear. So every stamp with the letters HD from plate 1A would have these characteristics on it. These marks in the upper right corner and the marks in the upper left corner, the 10 o'clock ray flaw. And then the other comment also postage slightly. So there are some marks in the word postage, which apparently are also distinguishing characteristics. The other information in the Litchfield book is he describes verbally, rather than using measurements, he talks about the positions of the letter. So he's saying the letter H is low and to the left, and we can see here that it's low and to the left, and then the D is high and centered. So yeah, the D is high and centered. And so I'm not going to go through all 11 plates, but without giving the game away, this is in fact a stamp from plate 1A. And so as I say, the process for most penny blacks is fairly straightforward. You look up the little table with the check letters that you have on your stamp, and then just look for the distinguishing characteristics, and look for the letter positions. If the letters are rotated, if they're angled, it'll be noted here, and that can be wonderful if you have a letter that's not square, up and down. That's an easy way of distinguishing it. I'll tell you the other way this is a plate 1A is that it's on a cover dated May 21st, 1840. So there's not a lot of it's definitely not plate 5 or later, and it would be very unlikely to be plate 3 or 4. So it's plates 1 and 2 were used right from the first day of use, May 6th. So the fact that this is on a May cover almost guarantees that it's plate 1A. But that's cheating, having it on a cover and looking at the date. But it's nice to have the verification. So this is just to be clear, the resources I was showing you earlier. This is all information in this Litchfield book, with the blue cover here. And this book is still available online. There's copies on eBay most of the time. I've seen them on ABE Books, and I think there's even some entrepreneur has scanned it and is selling PDF files. So it's available, and it's not an outrageous price. If you're interested, it's certainly not as outrageous as the price of the stamps. So it's a valuable resource if you have any interest at all in plating penny blacks. So that's the sort of the nuts and bolts approach. And then we can verify that it's plate 1A, because you'll see that in the table here, sorry to go back and forth, plate 1A and 1B have very similar characteristics because it is the same image. It's just that it was re-entered yet again and cleaned up to create plate 1B. So the difference in this description of plate 1A and B is plate 1B, it says left side stronger. So you can see that on the left side of the stamp, there's some breaks in the line work down there. And according to Litchfield, plate 1B has a stronger left side. The positions of the check letters would be the same on plate 1A and B, and the signs of the reentries in the corners are the same. So it's this left line weakness that distinguishes this as a plate 1A stamp. And what you can see here, these are digital images from a guy in the UK. He runs a business called Sturminster Stamps, and in addition to selling stamps, he also sells CDs of these digital images. And I acquired a set of these a few years ago, and as I say, they're absolutely invaluable. So these are images. The one on the left, the plate 1A, that's cropped out of the photographic image of the imprimatur sheet. And then the one on the right is an actual sample of a 1B stamp. So in cases where Martin has access to a stamp that's better than the original imprimatur image, he'll include that in the digital file. So if we look at the stamp on the left that we're trying to plate, we can see it has these breaks in the left margin. And in the images from Sturminster, you can see those breaks in the left margin for plate 1A. But for plate 1B on the right, you can see that that left line is stronger. So on this basis, one would conclude that this is in fact a plate 1A stamp. And as I said, the date of the stamp means that it's definitely plate 1A. The plate 1B stamps didn't start to appear till later in May and into June. So that's the penny blacks. When we talk about the penny reds, things get a lot more complicated. There's a lot more plates, a lot more difficult to distinguish between them. So I'm going to show you the process that I go through using the information from the Fisher Brown books. And I don't actually use the books anymore because they've been digitized, and the Great Britain Philatelic Society maintains a database on their website, which started with the information from the books, but then it's been updated as people, examine the stamps and find that maybe some of the measurements are off. So the database is a living reference, which is amazingly valuable. And I'll just put in one of probably several plugs for the Great Britain Philatelic Society. Anybody who has an interest in this area of philately, it's absolutely invaluable to join the GBPS. So this book included a plating gauge, and in order to take these measurements now, we need the gauge, a magnifier. I used to use about a 5 times magnifier. These magnifiers are called linen testers, and the advantage is you can sit them on something and you don't have to hold it at the right distance. It automatically focuses on whatever you're looking at. I believe they're used in the textile industry, which is where the name comes from, but they're wonderful for working with stamps as well. The one I show here is one I've gotten later in life. It's a 10 times magnifier, and it's absolutely wonderful. And then you need something to sort of hold the stamps in position and protect them. So I have a little bit of cardboard with some stamp mounts on it that I use to hold the stamps while I take these measurements. And so what Roland Brown and Harold Fisher came up with was a scheme for measuring the position of the letters in from the outside margins to the left and right, and then from the bottom. And these are termed A, B, C, and D. And so the challenge using the gauge is to figure out what these measurements are. So this is a sample stamp with letters MJ, which we'll go through. And there's other characteristics of this stamp which we can use to confirm the plating, but we'll start with the measurements. This is a page from the Brown Fisher book that shows how to take the measurements for each of the letters A through T or A through L, depending on whether it's the left side or the right side of the stamp. We don't need to get into these details. And this is literally how I use it. You have the stamp in a mount, you put the gauge over it, and then you put the magnifier over the gauge. And you can see in the middle sort of the view that you would see, and then I've blown it up on the right. And so the gauge is set up with this sloping line, cunningly set up with this sloping line. So you align these dashed lines with the base of the square, or the side of the square if you're taking the measurement in from the side. But in this case, we're taking the bottom measurement, the B measurement. So you align the dash lines with that lower border, and then you slide the gauge across until the sloping line just touches the point of the letter. And then you read through the middle of the letter to what number it lines up with down below. So this measurement would be identified as 4 plus. If the 4 lined up with the middle of the letter, it would be a 4. If the 5 lined up, it would be a 5. So you have 4, 4 plus, 5 minus, and 5. And that's how you get to a 30th of a millimeter. If it lined up, the difference between the 4 and the 5 is 1 millimeter. And so by dividing that space into thirds, we end up with a 30th of a millimeter as the accuracy of this measurement. Using the gauge, it looks completely overwhelming when you first try this out. I was a much younger and more foolish person when I first started doing this, but it's amazing how quickly you get used to it. And as you can see on the picture on the left, you have to slide the gauge back and forth on the stamp, keep that baseline lined up, and also keep the magnifier in position. And you really wish you had a third hand sometimes, but you very quickly get good at it. And okay, so then once you have the 4 measurements, you can either do a manual lookup, and so in the book on the left, or the page from the book on the left, these are the measurements for plates 1A through 45. Why would I look in volume one? Because this stamp has a Maltese cross on it. And the Maltese crosses were used up to about plate 45. There are very occasional uses on stamps later than plate 45. But for the most part, if you have a Maltese cross postmark, you know that it's plate 1 through 45. And so the image on the left shows the page from the book, which has all of the measurements for MJ. And when I started doing this in the 1980s, you'd work your way down looking for a match for your measurements. The way you do it now is you go on the Great Britain Philatelic Society website, and they have this plating tool. You select the letters you want. So I've selected position MJ. You type in the 4 measurements, and up comes a list of potential matches ranked from the closest match to the most distant. So in this case, the closest match is plate 27, based on the measurements I took off the stamp and entered into the website. They also have a tool on the website which allows you to not have to use the plastic gauge. Take a scanned image of a stamp and then take the same measurements digitally. I haven't used this tool. I got used to using the plastic gauge when I started doing this, and I've yet to sit down and give this a good try. I find it a little inconvenient that I would have to scan every stamp, but I end up scanning a lot of my stamps anyway, so it's not that much of an inconvenience. So again, on the website, once it's identified the potential plates, plate 27 was the closest match, and these are the 4 measurements from plate 27. And then it gives you a list of characteristics. And that's how you can then, with this ranked list of possible matches, start to narrow it down to the stamp that you have. And in this case, between this table says refer to table of plate characteristics. So if there's a plate that has common characteristics across all of the stamps on the plate, there's another table you can go to. So for plate 27, northeast frame line open. So if we go to the northeast corner of the stamp, you can see that the line is almost non-existent. That box is almost completely open. Northwest 10 o'clock ray flaw. And this is different than the ray flaw on the penny blacks. It's not a missing ray, it's a heavier ray that appears on these penny reds. And then here's the big one, J square. And you can see that the letter J has a square look to it. And this was a defect in the punch that was used for a period of time. So there's a series of plates where all of the J's are square. And in addition, there's what they call the J flaw, which is this blur. Come on. This mark to the right of the J. That's a J flaw. And you can see in the upper right up for plate 27, it says J stroke flaw weak. In fact, this is a strong one, but it is definitely a J flaw. And then the other characteristic in the upper description, vertical guideline, bottom right square. And you can see quite clearly on this stamp. It's one of the reasons I chose this stamp, because the characteristics are so clear. You can see a very clear guideline on the inside of the box. The guidelines were lines that were scribed into the steel plates, excuse me, before they started laying down the images as an aid to aligning the transfer roller. So in a perfectly aligned stamp, the guidelines disappear under the edges of the stamp, but very often you get traces of horizontal or vertical guidelines within the stamp image itself, and those are wonderfully useful for verifying the plating of a stamp, as in this case. There are a whole host of characteristics. This is a mashup of things like guidelines. On some stamps, the baseline is thickened or doubled. You can see the right hand B on this one is tilted to the right. There's a very heavy line on the right side of this stamp. It's called a recut. They actually went in and engraved the line more heavily. The northeast weak. There's a gap in the northeast border here. There's another vertical guide. So one of the when I talk about the amount of time you need to learn about this to develop this skill, one of the key things is understanding all of the various um, flaws and characteristics that can show up on a particular stamp. You'd never get one stamp with all of these characteristics. This is a, as I say, a mashup showing a huge number of characteristics, but it gives you an idea of the sorts of things that you're looking out for. And as I explained earlier, each of these characteristics comes from a different stage in the plate creation process. So some of these are specific to a stamp, some of them are specific to a plate or to a subset of the images on a plate. So this plate 27 MJ stamp that we've been looking at, I've just blown up the key characteristics that allow us to confirm that it's plate 27. There's a very light vertical guideline in the upper right square. There's a very obvious vertical guideline in the lower square. There's the J flaw, the fact that it's a square J. And then the M has a westward tilt to it. It's when they punched the letter M, the punch wasn't perfectly aligned. And so there's a definite tilt to the west. We can then visually confirm the stamp. So this is the digital imprimatur image on the right for plate 27. And I've highlighted stamp MJ on the plate and blown it up in the middle. And so if we take a quick look at our stamp and the image from the imprimatur, you can see what I mean about the quality of the image. It leaves a lot to be desired, but it's clear enough that we can make out the key characteristics. And then a bonus of using these sheets is if you have a stamp that's been badly cut and you have a trace of the adjacent stamps appearing next to it, the width of the margins are all over the place. You can see on the imprimatur, the margin to the right is quite narrow, to the bottom is quite wide, and then to the left is sort of in the middle. So if you have traces of the adjacent stamps on your cutout imperforate stamp, that can be hugely valuable in determining the plate number. And then this is, again, using the third party images from Sturminster stamps. And you can, so this is the way they're arranged. You'd have a file with all of the MJ stamps from through a whole series of plates. So all of these stamps have the letters MJ, and then the white identifying number on each stamp tells you what plate it's from. So this is a way of very quickly, if you have a stamp MJ, you can go through these images and look for the characteristics of your stamp to help you quickly identify which stamp you have. And I'll tell you, there's a lot of serious platers who never do the measurements. They don't do the measurements at all. They do it all visually. And they've been doing it long enough that they can look at a stamp. I joke that they can sniff a stamp and tell you what plate it's from or what group of plates it's from. They can narrow it down very quickly based on the ink color, the orientation, whether there's a tilt to the images on the plate, whatever. And then they'll use images like these ones from Sturminster to absolutely, definitively determine what the plate number is. I still do the measurements because I get satisfaction from that, and I'll tell you, there's been a few times where I've caught, I've obtained a stamp which is allegedly from a particular plate, and because I do the measurements, I've actually determined that no, it wasn't that plate, it was a similar plate. So I like the idea of doing the measurements as insurance in addition to these other characteristics. The other advantage to the third-party image sets are that you can see on this upper right image, there's two stamps in red. So those are stamps from plates where there were missing imprimaturs. So the black and white images are from the imprimatur sheets, but for those two plates, which I think is 23 and 24, or 22 and 23, the stamp MJ was missing from those imprimaturs. So there were no imprimatur images, but Martin has found stamps from those locations and included them in the image file so that um, if you had a stamp and you were trying to match it and it didn't appear on the imprimatur sheet, you're out of luck if you're just using these imprimatur sheets. But by using the third party images, um, more often than not, you'll find that the gaps have been filled. So that's plate one. Um, and I've run through how I do the plating. I mentioned the E gauge, the new tool on the GBPS website, which allows you to take the the position measurements without using the plastic gauge. There's another technique that some people use where they will scan a stamp and then change the toning of the stamp in a package like Photoshop so that they can overlay a stamp over the various imprimatur images. So they'll scale it to exactly the right size and then tone it so that you can sort of see through most of the stamp. And then they'll slide it around over the imprimatur images until they find an image that precisely lines up. That's beyond my skill set. I may try that one day, but I know that there are people who do plating that way and have been quite successful with it. The die 2 stamps with stars. So these are the stamps that started coming out in around 1855, 1866 with the re-engraved die. Roland Brown and Harold Fisher never got to the die 2 imprimatur sheets. Both of them were deceased by the time the fifth book had come out, and nobody has taken up that that challenge. There's about 70 plates that are die 2 with the stars in the upper corners. And the only way to plate these is by using the images. There's no way of taking measurements. There are reference books that document the characteristics. Most of the reference books are out of print now, but if you can find one, they can be useful. But the reality is the best way to plate these is with the third-party image sets. And then we get to the 4 corner letter stamps, the famous ones. And when I tell people I collect penny reds, a lot of people think that these are the stamps I collect. I do collect them, but my focus is on the earlier stamps. These ones, because, and I think most of you are probably aware, if it's got the letters in the upper corners instead of the stars, it means that in the side of the stamp in the scroll work, the plate number has been engraved. So in this case, it's 157. So this is from plate 157. The letters, as I mentioned before, are sans serif. And yeah, this is how I started when I was in my teens, collecting stamps from this era and trying to collect a full set of from plate 70, is it 75 or 71? I can never remember. Right through to 225, with the exception of plate 77, of which only 5 or 6 examples exist. And then there's a couple of other plates that were never used. They didn't meet the quality control. So there's a few gaps, but there's about 150 plates in total from this series. And as I say, in theory, they're dead easy to plate. You need a good magnifier sometimes. However, sometimes the engraving is not that good. Sometimes the stamp is misperforated, which means, so in this case, this stamp here, you've lost the plate number on the right side, although the plate number on the left side is visible. But very often the cancellation will obscure all or part of the plate number, and it's not absolutely clear what the plate number is. So the trick I use is the same imprimatur sheets from the Postal Museum that assist with the earlier stamps, the die 1 and die 2 star stamps. The same imprimatur sheets are available for the four corner letter stamps. And most people would say, well, I don't need those because I can read the plate number off the scroll work. But I'll tell you, fairly regularly, I'll have a stamp and I'll say, gee, I'm not sure that that actually is the plate number in the scroll work. And again, the letters were hand punched. So there's variations. You can see that the letter M here is off to the right and a little high and has a bit of a tilt. So fairly regularly, I'll fire up the imprimatur sheet. You know, the stamp was billed as being from plate 212, and I was very easily able to confirm that it is in fact 212. I've shown below here, you can see the letters K and M. That's a blow up from the poor quality imprimatur sheet, but the quality is good enough that when you compare it to a blow up of the stamp, a magnified image of the stamp, you can see that the K is off to the left, the M is off to the right, and the M's a little high. So and you can look at each of the visible corner letters. The L in the upper left corner is a little to the right, as it is on the imprimatur. So these imprimatur sheets they're not vital for plating the four corner letter stamps, but they're certainly a good backup for confirming platings where, as I say, if it's misperforated or the cancellation obscures the plate number. The final group I wanted to briefly touch on are the tuppence issues. These are easier in the sense that they only ever used 13 plates. In 40 years of production, there were only 13 plates prepared, plates 1 through 15, and plates 10 and 11 were never used. They didn't, there were quality control issues with them, so they were never used. And so within the Tuppenny Blues, there's famously 4 different varieties. There's the original plates 1 and 2 that did not have these horizontal white lines. These are expensive stamps. These are not common stamps. And when their price is reasonable, there are definitely problems, with the margins or whatever. So that's plates 1 and 2. Plates 3 and 4, which came out in 1841. They added, this corresponded to the transition from the black to the red stamps in the penny stamps. So the Tuppenny stamp without the white lines came out with the penny black. The Tuppenny stamp with the white lines came out around the time that the penny red was introduced in 1841. And then we have plates 4 to 6 were used with stars in the upper corners during the perforated era. And then we have the 4 corner letter plates 7 through 15. It's interesting because there's only 13 plates. They're relatively easy to plate just using the information in the Gibbons catalog. There's indications of plate characteristics and so on that allow you to distinguish many Tuppenny Blues and determine the plate just using the catalog. There's a specialized book here. There was one done by a guy named Osborne back in the 30s or 40s, which was the definitive work. This book by Mike Jackson is a wonderful one. It includes, I believe, illustrations of all of the positions on all of the plates. So it's if somebody's interested in plating penny or tuppence blues, this is these days regarded as the definitive work. I think it's still in print. If not, there'd be used copies available fairly easily. And then I keep plugging these third-party digital images. They include up to not the 4 corner letter stamps, but plates 1 through 6 are included in the digital images. So, and that's what I use when I'm working with tuppence blues. I go straight to the third-party images and very quickly verify what I have, and they're in pairs. Plates 1 and 2 on the left side are the ones with outlines. Plates 3 and 4. Plate 3 was only ever issued imperf. Plate 4, imperf and perf, and then 5 and 6 are only perforated. So getting near the end here, I just wanted to quickly run through the resources. Stanley Gibbons Specialized Catalog, absolutely invaluable to anybody collecting this era and wanting to understand how everything ties together, how the stamps were produced, the characteristics of the stamps. Yeah, a lot of the work that's been done on repairs to the black plates and the red plates is now documented in the Gibbons catalog. A lot of varieties, postmarks, that sort of thing. So it's an invaluable resource. It does not, however, with the exception of the Tuppence Blues, the catalog is not much use in plating. They try to. They illustrate a lot of varieties and unique characteristics, but it would be challenging to sit down with a batch of penny blacks or penny reds and plate them just using the information in the catalog. It's specialized, but it's not that specialized. The Guidelines to the Penny Black by Litchfield is been the reference book I've used for penny black since the 1980s, and I use it constantly. If I'm looking at purchasing a stamp in an auction or a sale, I'll go to stamp shows and I'll have a copy of Litchfield in my bag that I take. It's lightweight and dead easy to use. The 5-volume plating of the penny, the Brown and Fisher books were the basis for doing measurements, but I can't remember the last time I referred to the actual books. I used the database on the GBPS website. So I used the plastic gauge from one of my original books, but I do the lookup online. These books are still available. They come up occasionally on eBay. They're not outrageously expensive. And I believe the GBPS still has some copies of Volume 5 available, which would be worth if one were interested in this and wanted to get a hold of one of the plastic gauges, picking up a copy of Volume 5 from the GBPS would be probably the easiest way to go about doing that. And then I just mentioned the Tuppence Blue Plating Guide by Mike Jackson as being a really good resource for working with the Tuppence Blues. Websites, the GBPS website, invaluable. They've got the database of letter measurements and characteristics. They actually have links to the imprimatur sheets. So when you're working with, when you're doing your plating and looking up your measurements, you can click right through to the imprimatur sheets. And as I recall, they actually have copies of the imprimatur sheets on the GBPS website, so you can download them right from there and at no charge. I think you might have to be a member to get at that, but yeah, there's no charge for any of the information. And there's also a wonderful document called Fisher Brown Rearranged, a massive PDF file, which expands. It has all of the data from the Fisher Brown books, and it's been revised and updated and has a lot of additional information about the stamp characteristics and so on. The Postal Museum website is good for getting at the imprimatur images. And Sturminster Stamps that's the guy I purchased the third-party digital images from in the last few years. And that's it.